Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So, welcome to the final Q&A video of 2021, folks. Thank you for sticking with me with these videos this year. I love doing them. I've got a lot of your questions to get through today, as per usual. But before I get going, just a little announcement about something fairly small that's going to change on this channel as of midnight tonight, I think, if I've got the timing right. As some of you might know, I've put out a video every 4 days for the whole of 2021, and before that too, I just kind of continued in the same pattern. So there's been a huge amount of content that I've put out this year. But what I'm going to do in 2022 is just reduce that content a little bit, because I work a job alongside doing this channel. I've had loads of stuff going on in my life this last year, personal life and other things. So to be honest with you, I'm just struggling to keep up to that self-imposed schedule of putting a video out every 4 days. So what I'm going to do is, rather than have a video go out on the 4th, 8th, 12th, 16th, 20th like I've done, I'm probably going to alternate with doing a video every 5 and then every 6 days. So it kind of fits into a nice pattern to still do these Q&As at the end of the month with a few days gap either side of those videos, but it will allow me to do 6 videos a month rather than 8. So I'm just bringing things down a little bit, purely to help me and my sort of work-life balance, as it were, and allow me to do the other things that I do in life better, rather than neglecting everything, trying to do too much stuff. So unless you're someone who diarizes my videos and is watching out for when they go live, which I very much doubt anybody out there does, hopefully you shouldn't notice too much of a difference, if any. There's just going to be a couple of less videos a month floating about. So I just want to let you know that. Public service announcement over, so let's get into your questions. But fingers crossed you shouldn't notice. So, who's up first this month on the questions? Bandit Sharp. Thanks for the concise answer to my when is analog not truly analog? No problem at all. Influenced by your reply, the Italian handmade boutique analog pedal I was referring to is now up for sale and will be replaced by the real deal. Fantastic. Another question I have for you is regarding the importance of an amp's effects loop. You know, the pros and cons of either having one or not. I have 2 Victory heads, Countess Mark II and Duchess, and both have effects loops. I just sold a Fender Princeton 64 custom reverb hand-wired because it didn't have an effects loop and master volume. I'm already having regrets, as the Princeton had the far superior tone as a standalone amp when used without pedals. All of my modulation effects go through the Victory's effects loop, and drives go into the preamp as per the Bible. As good as they are though, the Victories just don't compare tonally to the Princeton. In simplistic terms then, what are the implications of putting all effects into the front end? Can't find a definitive answer or an opinion I value anywhere. Cheers, man. Well, hopefully you value my opinion a little bit. Sorry to hear that you've got rid of a piece of gear that you really like. I've done that before. It's a horrible feeling. And you know, you sell something and you instantly miss it and you can't get it back. So sorry to hear that. In terms of the Victory heads, I'm not too familiar with Victory, but from what I gathered, they are mostly British voiced amps, I think. So it could just be that you like Fender amps and you're now playing something that isn't a Fender amp and it's just not to your tastes, because there's so much that goes into an amplifier design, way more than just whether it has an effects loop or not. So the Fender amp, I'm guessing, would have been 6V6 or 6L6. If the Victories are British voiced, as I suspect they are, I'm guessing they'll be EL34 or 84. So it could just be that you don't like the particular tube sets that you're playing, how the amps are voiced, all that sort of stuff. So it might just be that you don't get on with Victory, and if you went with a different amp manufacturer that does have effects loops, then that might be much more to your taste. So I don't think it's as simple as whether it has a loop or not. But the best way of thinking about an effects loop is it goes between your preamp section of your amp and the power amp section of your amp. So the preamp is where the guitar signal is boosted up, because the guitar signal on its own is tiny, and it's boosted up just to a point where the power amp can then work with it and make it crazy loud. The EQ is in the preamp as well, but on a lot of amps, modern amps especially, it's where a lot of the gain happens. So on classic non-master volume tube amps, most of the sort of big bloomy distortion comes from the power tubes and the power transformer and all that sort of stuff. Whereas on more modern amps, a lot of the gain comes from the preamp. So if you have an amp that has a gain control and a master volume, usually that means most of the gain is happening in the front end. Attenuators are more where the gain is happening in the power amp section and you're bringing the volume down. So attenuation is different from master volume. Now, for me, I like having all of my effects straight in the front end because I pretty much use non-master volume old school tube amps. So they don't have effects loops and they never have. And there are ways of doing it with like the tube amp expander and stuff, but I just don't go there. I put all of my stuff in the front end and I really like the simplicity of doing that. And one of the big downsides is if your amp is gaining up on its own and you're putting something like a delay in the front end, then the crunchy amp will distort your delay tails and they can sound really kind of grainy and ugly, which can be a cool sound, but it's not for everyone. And as you say, it's not, as per the Bible, it's not the traditional way of doing it. So for me, I would, if I'm setting an amp gainy and I want to run a delay in the front end, if you turn the blend down or the delay level or whatever it is on your pedal to almost the bottom and just tickle it in, it can still work really nicely. Same with reverb. You don't want to go over the top with it, but it can work going into the front end. And it's also important to say that effects loops in amps are not created equal. So an amp that has an effects loop, it could be a really good one that's really transparent and it's tube buffered and all that sort of lovely stuff, or it could be a bit of a rubbish one. So if you've got big runs of cable like in the middle of your signal chain within the amp, that can degrade the tone on its own. So they're always a compromise, I think, effects loops, but I love the simplicity of going in the front end. Bear in mind as well that modulation effects, as you put in the loop, back in, say, 1974, take something like a Phase 90, Eddie Van Halen would have plugged his guitar into the Phase 90 and then the Phase 90 into a cranked Marshall. So you're putting the modulation into the overdrive, whether that's a pedal or an amp or whatever. So I love having my modulation pedals before my overdrives as well. And if, just because it's not in the Bible, experiment as well. You can get some really interesting and different tones by putting effects before gain stages, whether that's a pedal or an amp. So I would say it's just that you don't like the Victory heads. They might not be to your tastes. I know a lot of Fender amps have effects loops. It might be worth looking into that. But yeah, just experiment. I'm not a fan of effects loops. A lot of people are, but they're usually most relevant when you're getting a lot of gain from the front end of your amp, which, you know, with something like I'm guessing a Blackface Fender custom reverb, unless you're absolutely diming the amp, you'll probably find that your delays going into the front end will sound absolutely fine. So just experiment, but I would wager it's probably because you're not a fan of the Victory heads. Enrico Palazzo, always good to have you on board, Enrico, in these Q&As. Thanks, Joe. As always, I have a few questions. Wow, there's 4. I'll try and get to them quickly. Number 1, why an ES330 and not an Epiphone Casino? I love the cherry red finish of the 330, which I think the Casinos didn't ever come in. I think they're usually sunburst, the Casinos. I like the black plastic pickup covers rather than the chrome, which the 330s did have after 64 or something like that, but the early ones had the black plastic covers, which I actually prefer the look of. And also I really like the dots on thin line guitars on the neck, whereas I think the Casino, I could be totally wrong on this, but I think they usually have like the sort of parallelograms rather than the dots. So I think I just prefer the look of the Gibson before you even get into how they're made nowadays. And all that stuff. But I did also watch a video before buying my 330 of how the guitars are made in the Memphis plant, which I'm not sure is still going, but mine was built in Memphis. And I just love the sort of handcrafting of the instruments that I saw there. So I really wanted to get my hands on a Memphis custom shop guitar. I'm not sure where the Epiphones are made. I'm going to assume somewhere over in the East. I don't know exactly. But I just love the sort of the handcrafting that goes on in the custom shop. So that was why I went with the Gibson over the Epiphone. Number 2, I know you like super vintage correct stuff. I do. But have you ever done weird mods to your guitar? I'm not talking like putting a Floyd Rose on a Telecaster, but stuff like the Jimmy Page wiring for the Les Paul, putting a PAF pickup as a neck pickup for a Telly and stuff like that. Not so much. Usually I'm pretty traditional in terms of my wiring. I start with a vintage specification, and then if I want something tweaking to my tastes, I go from there. So usually the vintage spec is absolutely fine for me and I love it. I do occasional things like on my Strat, for example. I like bright, defined guitar sounds, but I wire the bottom tone knob of my Strat, which a lot of people do nowadays, to the bridge pickup, so you can roll some of the really sharp highs off to make it a little bit more humbucker-like. But having a 250k pot there it was kind of taking a bit of the high end away, even when the pot was wide open. So I put a 500k pot in the bottom tone that's wired to the bridge pickup, just to retain a bit of the clarity, but allow me to have the tone on the bridge. So I do little things like that, but I generally stick with a vintage spec unless, for me, something needs changing to suit me, and then I'll get a bit creative. But generally speaking, I stick with vintage spec stuff. Number 3, do you think the material of the fretboard has any effect on the sound? Yes, absolutely. I think everything in the guitar has an effect on the sound. The whole thing is a system. Wood choices, especially. I made a video probably last year comparing the 330 to the 335, my Heritage 535. And as we saw, in terms of most of the spec there, they're pretty equal, but the construction, the wood type, made a huge amount of difference to how those guitars sound, and the pickups, of course. So yeah, I think everything makes a difference. A rosewood Strat will sound fundamentally different to a maple fretboard Strat, for example. So yeah, I think it all makes a difference. I think with vintage spec pickups, especially if they're slightly microphonic, which they generally are, especially if they're not overly wax potted, I think more of those fundamental differences in the acoustic sound of the guitar will be picked up over a modern 18k super wax potted high output idiot bucker. So I think a vintage spec pickup will pick up more of those differences. But yeah, I think everything makes a difference to how a guitar sounds. The whole thing is a system. And number 4, do you prefer rosewood or ebony for the fretboard? I love the ebony fretboard on my white Falcon. It's super smooth, it's easier to play than the rosewood, and you play faster. Gibson guitars, I generally prefer rosewood, but on Fenders, I generally prefer maple. My Les Paul Custom has ebony. I think my Gretsch Durojet will have ebony as well. For me, if a guitar works as a complete guitar and I love it, that's all that matters. I'm not someone that will get super picky about, this has rosewood and I really want Powell Ferro or something like that. I don't get too hung up on those sorts of things. But yeah, I think on Fender guitars, maple, Gibson, rosewood, but ebony's fine too. If a guitar works for you, it works for you. Sam Mason, love this, so good. Plus Emily on drums. This is the song I put out at the start of December, Snow. This is probably the closest any of us will get to being in the darkness. Yeah, I dream of being in the darkness when I was a kid. I mean this in the best possible way, which is always a good start for a comment. The production / some of the melodic content reminds me of I Am Santa by the Darkness, but with a healthy glug of Springsteen, a dash of Dwight Yoakam, and half a teaspoon of Thin Lizzy. I mean, how could that not be in the best possible way? I would wear that as a badge of honour. That's my influences in one sentence. So I'm glad you like the song. I got a lot of good feedback for that song, and yeah, it was just a lot of fun putting it together. We did it pretty quickly in about 3 weeks, I think. So thanks to everyone involved in that made it happen. And speaking of someone who was involved, Emily Dolan Davies. So Emily usually plays drums for me. She's a session musician, among other things. And we've worked together a few times, but she played drums on the Snow song. She said, sounding amazing, Joe. Feeling so privileged to have been a part of it, so thank you. No, thank you, Emily. Like, if you ever need a session drummer, Emily is your lady. She will just take whatever you give her, whether it's prescriptive or complete free license. It's usually free license when I work with a session player. And she just makes it sound like a song. She's a phenomenal player. So if you're ever in the market for session drums, check out Emily Dolan Davies. She is wonderful. Mike Zate, who is Dr. Z himself. Excellent video, Joe. Great explanation of its design history and an even better demonstration of the wide array of classic tones at different settings and with various guitars. This amp is a real jaw dropper. Can't even say jaw dropper. When demoed at my shop, every player is amazed at the 310 sound, which is unique. Thanks again, Joe. So it was so lovely to get that positive feedback from Dr. Z himself, and this was of course a demo of the Dr. Z Z Master, which is by far and away the biggest video I've had in recent months. Astonishing amp, so many good comments, but I kind of picked on Dr. Z himself because he was there, and he's brilliant at going into the comment section of videos that people make of his gear and answering the really technical questions. So there are a few other people under that video asking things about the amp, and before I could reply, Dr. Z was in there answering himself. So I love having Dr. Z on board. Fabulous company, fabulous amp designer, and the Z Master, the Joe Walsh signature, is just a jaw-dropping amp, as Dr. Z says. So a lot of good feedback there. And one more comment on that video. Amp sounds killer with all guitars. I dread to think how loud it is with the volume maxed. Yep, it's pretty loud. It's a 30-watt amp, and it really, really screams and sings. So I'm thinking of making a video soon running the Z Master with the Z Rec, kind of like the two flagship Dr. Z's together, and just seeing how that sounds. It might sound terrible, but I have a feeling it'll sound great because they're both astonishing amps. So yeah, a lot of love for the Z Master this month. Rene Otten, I think it's Rene or is it Rene? Whichever. One of the best tones I've ever heard. Your playing is getting better and better too. Well, that's always good to hear. And this was boosting the JTM45 with the Klon, or with the Decibelix Golden Horse. And yeah, there were some really special sounds in that video, and a lot of people were saying it was really, really great sounding. I think it definitely got too much at times, as I said in the outro of that video, when you're really gaining up the Klon and hitting the level and slamming it in, the amp kind of starts to sort of sag and misbehave a bit and become really sort of murky and undefined. But when used tastefully, yeah, a Klon is a wonderful boost for a Marshall amp. Smedley Butler, that is a fantastically designed pedal and sounds great. This was the Crazy Tube Circuits Crossfire, which I was really happy to be part of the initial launch of, and thank you to Christos, if you're watching, for involving me in that. It was a lot of fun doing it. It really is a great pedal. I think in terms of a Fender amp in a box pedal, it's the best I've ever played, and there's something about that TS-808 side of that pedal that I just love. I'm not usually a massive Tube Screamer fan, but there was something about that one that I just want to have. I want to play every day. It's a wonderful sounding pedal. So brilliant concept, the 808 into a sort of Fender amp in a box type thing. Definitely nails that sort of Stevie Ray Vaughan thing. But yeah, it's a great pedal, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, Smedley. Kira Barsmith, sounds great. Tubes can really add a sparkle and third dimension to the sound. I like the idea of having a tube circuit at the front of the pedal chain to get the most out of other effects down the line, which is exactly what I've done on my 2022 pedal board. Now that video will be going live at midnight tonight, a stroke of New Year here in the UK. And yeah, I have the Audio Kitchen Small Trees, which Kira was talking about here, right on the front end of my board as a sort of always on buffer tone conditioner thing. Glorious sounding thing. I'm using it pretty mildly compared to what it can do, but it just makes everything that 5% better. And buffering the entire board with a tube stage, it really does have a kind of feel and sound about it. It's not super obvious, but it's just that kind of like 1% extra that just makes you kind of smile when you play guitar. So big fan of that. GC Kellock. 4 mics, how can the speaker tone be determined with so much coloration and cancellation? Also, the passive speaker in the cab will absorb some of the active speaker energy other than that which aligns in phase. Well, having the second speaker in the amp, we're talking 3 close mics buried in a speaker here. You're not really going to hear anything of what the other speaker is doing because it was disconnected. Yes, it might zap a bit of energy, but it pretty much makes no difference. It's the honest truth of it. I did have a gap in there, and it sounded a little bit weird having a big open gap and the sound kind of ricocheting off the back of the cab and coming out the front. So I needed something in there. So I left the dead speaker in there just to kind of stop the sound coming out the front. It didn't make any difference, is the honest truth. In terms of using 4 mics, I always use 4 mics when I'm recording a video, usually. I have the 3 close mics and a room mic. Now the 3 close mics, I have a ribbon on the outside of the cone to get the kind of thumpy sub bass and very low mids. I have a dynamic mic kind of just off the center of the sort of dust cap to capture the sort of bitey, sizzly mid-range, and a condenser right over the center of the dust cap to get that really sort of pristine top end. And usually those 3 balanced out sound like the speaker does in the room. And of course I can adjust the blend of that a tiny bit if I need to, but I usually don't. As long as your engineering is good and those 3 close mics are perfectly in phase, and you can check that in Pro Tools, you just zoom right in on a peak or a trough or a zero crossing point, and you can see they're not identical waveforms because they're 3 different mics, but as long as they are perfectly in phase with each other at all the right places, then they sound much more like the speaker does in the room than a single mic ever could. So I always do that, and my whole goal when shooting a demo video is getting the sound that I'm listening to in the room coming out of those speakers over there. That is what I see my job as, is giving you the most accurate representation as I can, and I can do that 10 times better with multi-mics, balancing them out, and if I think, oh, it's sounding a little bit low-end heavy compared to what I had in the room, I can bring the ribbon down slightly and it nails the sound. So good engineering is the most important thing when using multi-mics on a guitar speaker. Poor engineering, yes, you'll get phase cancellation all over the place and it won't sound anything like the sound in the room. But if your engineering is good, it's much better. A room mic will always be relatively in or out of phase. It's never going to be perfect because it's a totally different sound source. You've got millions of reflections rather than having the microphone buried in the speaker. If you just flip the phase, one will be a little bit thicker than the other. The thick one's the one you go with to get the most phase, sort of have it most in phase with the close mics. So yeah, I mean, it all comes down to good engineering. And once you're practiced at it, trust me, you can get something sounding much more accurate as a representation than you can with just one mic. That's the truth of it. Yi Sen Chai, are the Tiamans higher output or lower compared to the Ray Butts? So this is the TV Jones Tiamans, which are kind of Dynasonic type things, and the Ray Butts is the full fidelity Filtron, which is a super vintage correct Filtron. It depends how you define output. To me, they sound pretty equal in volume. If anything, the Filtron sounds a little bit louder and more spiky. In terms of DC resistance, the Tiamas are about 3 times the DC resistance of the Filtrons. So the Ray Butts is about 4K as an output. I think the Tiama and the bridge one especially is like 11 or 12. So it just goes to show that you cannot take DC resistance as output, and the 12 K pickup is not 3 times louder than a 4K pickup by any stretch of the imagination, almost the other way around at times. So yes, the Tiamas have a higher DC resistance, but they're certainly not too much louder, if at all. So yeah, you can't take DC resistance as output. Chaplin, nice demo. I am new here. Welcome. You seem to know a lot about boutique pedals. Sadly, I do. It's not a cheap hobby, but it's a hobby nonetheless. If you had the recording session of your life and could choose only one overdrive pedal to get your dream tone, which would you choose? Notice I said recording session, not gig. For gigs, the dream tone isn't quite as vital, so you may gravitate towards a nice dual switch pedal for the versatility it provides. I would probably still go with a dual switch pedal for my dream overdrive. If you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said the Kingsley Page. No questions asked. I love that pedal. But since then, I've got the Kingsley Jester, which is a dual pedal. You have a boost on one side and an overdrive on the other, 2 12AX7s inside. There is nothing you can't do with that pedal. You can cover all the ground, from clean boost to buffering and transparent stuff, all the way through to kind of screaming metal if you want to. It covers everything. It does everything. So for me, yeah, the Kingsley Jester. It's on the 2022 board, as you will hopefully see at midnight. Just a wonderful pedal. I put a demo video up of that a couple of days ago, and a huge amount of love in the comments for that pedal. It is just ridiculous. So Kingsley Jester. Paul Leonard Ewing. I can never work out how to pronounce your surname, Paul. Please do let me know in the comments and try and sort of spell it out so I can get it right in the future. Impressive. Hard to believe it sells for $229 US. That's cheaper than 90% of hundreds of mediocre op-amp pedals that are nothing more than a tube screamer with a different name and some gaudy graphics on yet another Hammond 1590B enclosure. Yep, that is, where are we? The Hageman Tube Overdrive. Pretty affordable. It's a very kind of budget-friendly way into the world of boutique tube pedals. But yeah, sounds amazing, and a huge amount of love for this in the comments as well. So I'm going to make a much bigger feature on tube pedals early next year, of which this will be featuring along with the Kingsley stuff, the Effector stuff, all of that. But yeah, Jim Hageman makes amazing pedals, and this is the first of his tube pedals I've got to try out, but it is wonderful. Ben Spinks. Out of interest, will the Magma 57 still gain up with the drive all the way down? And then this is the Origin Effects Magma 57, which is the kind of magnatone in the box thing. And you cannot turn off the overdrive side of it. You can switch the vibrato in and out, but the overdrive is always on when the pedal's engaged. You can get it pretty clean, is the truth of it. If you turn the drive all the way down and the output level all the way up, you can get it so it's pretty sparkly. If you hit the guitar hard, it will usually gain up a little bit, but we're talking a tiny bit of grit, nowhere near as much as the Crazy Tube Circuit's Memphis did in that video. That was quite crunchy. You can definitely get the Origin cleaner than that. But again, watch the pedalboard video at midnight. The Origin's on there, and I'm running it as clean as I can get away with, and hopefully you'll hear it pretty sparkly clean. So yeah, about 80% clean, but if you hit the guitar, you will get a bit of hair on the top. Mickey Three Finger. Excellent video. I learned all I needed to know. Great. I would like to add that measuring pots can also allow you to identify unmarked pots. That's true. I would like to know if measuring a pot at various positions will tell you whether it is log or linear. Thank ya. Yes, absolutely. You can, especially if you have like a Fender guitar with a knob that has 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4 on it, you can measure the resistance of the pot at every single position, plot it on the graph, and it will either give you a straight line or a curve. So you can tell that way. But the easiest way to tell is to open the pot wide up, measure the absolute value of the pot, and then turn it down approximately 50% of the way. If the reading is about 50% of the maximum value, then it will be a linear pot. If it's either 20%-ish or 80%-ish, depending on which way you're turning the pot, then it will be a log pot. It's just which way around you've connected it. So that's the easiest way to tell. Go to 50% and see whether it's about 50% of the value or not. Michael Kaz. Me too, Joe. I am anti-social media for numerous reasons. Yep, I'm not a fan of it at all. I do have a Facebook music page floating around, but I almost never post on it, and I don't have any personal social media myself. I wish someone would recreate that Rockman sound with an improved signal to noise ratio. Such a unique sound. I had the Rockman 1-3 space rack units. Even the chorus and the cleans were uniquely special. There was something about that guitar Ace, wasn't there? And it's a £5 practice headphone amplifier, but especially running it into the amp, it just nails that sound. It's a sound we all know, whether we like it or not, it's a different matter, but we all know it from the 80s. And yeah, it would be interesting. As far as I'm aware, no one's tried to recreate the Rockman sound in a sort of boutique pedal format. It had a pretty substantial noise floor, as Michael says. I think Rockman are still going, and maybe that's why no one's tried to kind of replicate it, because they still make it themselves, possibly, I don't know. But yeah, it definitely has a sound. Whether it would sell on a wide enough scale to be worth someone taking that circuit and adapting it, lowering the noise floor and trying to market it, I don't know. I would assume probably not, because otherwise someone would have done it by now. But yeah, there is definitely something about that Rockman sound. I'd love to try out some more of the Rockman stuff. I think it is very cliched from what I've heard, but that can be a really good thing if you're after that cliched 80s sparkly guitar sound. So yeah, I'd like to try out some more Rockman stuff in the future if I can. On the Edge of Time. Which would you think is better for jangly post-punk, the Analog Man or Jam? I'm thinking the Jam, but really wish you could get it with a mix feature like the Analog Man. But the Jam sounds clear enough that you wouldn't need a mix knob, and I have and love the CE2, but definitely kind of dampens a chime and adds some congestion. Personally, I would say for overdrive, especially going into the front end of an amp, the Analog Man, because it seems to me, I could be wrong on this because I've sold the Jam, but this is going from memory, the Analog Man takes off a little bit more low end, which is usually best for going into the front end of a gainy amp, so I'm guessing that's what you'd be using for post-punk stuff. And it just keeps the low end tight, and it just makes it sound a bit sort of more chimey and jangly overall, whether that's because it has more high end or less low end, similar type effect, I'm not sure. But my instinct would say the Jam on that front. It's a beautiful chorus. I run mine at 15 volts and it is just pristine. Mark Solby, great video as usual, Joe. Thank you. How does this one compare to the Effector tube drive? The tube drive with new old stock lower gain tubes seem to be your holy grail. Where's that? There it is. Yes, the old Effector tube drive. Wonderful sounding pedal. And as Mark says, I put lower gain vintage Mullard tubes in here. Wonderful thing, especially with the original tube set in, the 212X7s and the AT7, which is pretty high gain in this pedal, too high for me, which is why I use the lower gain tubes. They cover similar grounds for sure. There's definitely more tone shaping on the Kingsley because you have a 3-band EQ and mine has the sizzle knob, as it were. The Effector just has a tone knob, like a sort of Baxter dial EQ, a low and high boost and cuts on the switches, but you get more tone shaping on the Kingsley. But there is certainly a fairly substantial crossover in terms of the ground they cover. I'm sure I will compare them at some point in the future. I'm not sure when that will be, but there will be a comparison coming, probably in the tube pedal feature early next year. Michael Kaz again. Nice, Joe. Simon Jarrett makes incredible stuff. He is actually a fantastic guitar player too. I've had my eye on the Kingsley Minstrel for a long time. His pedals always remind me of those fat and creamy Steely Dan lead tones. Yeah, there's one thing about Simon Jarrett, and it's why I always feel a bit uncomfortable sending him demos of his stuff that I do, because I know he is just like a sort of top league guitar player, and he must look at me playing his pedals and just go, oh god, because I'm just there just hammering away with like dumb rock stuff, and he's like a really technically accomplished player, so he must think I'm something of an ape that's buying his pedals. But yeah, Simon is a wonderful guitarist, and yeah, he makes just outstanding stuff. I would love to check out more of the Kingsley stuff. It is quite pricey, especially importing it from Canada and paying shipping. But at some point in the future, I would love to try out some more stuff, because the Page and the Jester are just two of my favourite pedals I've ever played in my life. On the edge of time, I was actually about to put together a 4x12 of the S75 PVCs, but after watching this now, I'm thinking maybe I should be doing golds, which I wasn't even considering before. Do you find that the gold is ever too harsh? So this was the comparison of the Celestion Alco Gold and the Scumbag S75 PVC that I did. They are both going after the same sort of thing, that old kind of Celestion blue type sound. The Celestion definitely has more kind of bitey upper mids. The Scumbag is more flat frequency and relaxed in the mids in comparison, but they both have their uses. And yes, the gold can, for some applications, sound a bit harsh. The Scumbag, for some applications, can sound a bit flat in the mids. The two together, though, is godly. So what I do is I run both together in the 2x12, and that gives me the option. If I want to record a lead part, I can mic up the gold and get that sizzly mid-range. If I want to record a fat, woody rhythm part, I can mic up the Scumbag. I can mic up both together and blend them. So I like having the option of both. So yeah, they're different in the mid-range. They're going after the same thing, but they are different in the mid-range. So if you're doing a 4x12, maybe two of each, like in an X pattern, could be cool. The Scumbag is a slightly lower efficiency than the Celestion. I can't remember what the number is, but it's a couple of dB quieter. But in a 4x12, you won't notice that. So that's what I would do personally. The gold can be harsh. The Scumbag, as some people say, does sound a bit flat in the mids. But the two together is where the magic's at. I love that combination in my 2x12. And finally this month, a nice punchy one to end the year with. Wings 377. Unbiased review, this is not. Congrats on your $200 pedal. Now this was when I compared the Retrosonic flanger to the Moore Elect Lady or E-Lady. It wasn't really supposed to be an unbiased view because I live in the posh boutique world. So of course I like the Retrosonic flanger because that's the one I've spent the big money on. I have it on my board and it absolutely nails the sound of my original big box, big money electric mistress. The purpose of that video was to see whether a mass-produced mini pedal could compete with it. And in many ways it did, especially for the price. The Moore sounded brilliant. A little bit less kind of high fidelity in the top end and a little bit kind of more ADA flanger in its nature, but if you just want to kind of dip your toe into the Electric Mistress sound for $40 or whatever it is, it's wonderful. And if you want to take up a little bit of room on your board and just have that sound on occasion, it's wonderful. So it wasn't meant to be an unbiased review, it was a comparison to see how close the old Moore could get to the big money Retrosonic. That was the point. And if you kind of made a decision on one pedal or the other for your personal taste from that video, it achieved its goal. So it wasn't supposed to be unbiased because of course I live in the Retrosonic world way more than the Moore. But anyway. So there we are folks, the final question of 2021. So I hope you all have fantastic New Year's tonight, tomorrow, whenever it is. The big pedal board video will be coming at the stroke of midnight New Year UK time, so watch out for that. It's about 56 minutes long, but there's a lot of good stuff and a lot of changes that have happened this year. And yeah, thanks for sticking with me this year, folks. A few less videos next year, but hopefully that will allow me to create some better content because, of course, more is not always better. So there we are, folks. Thank you ever so much for watching. Please do carry on subscribing. I know I always say it, but it does make a huge difference. Any more questions, drop them in the comments. I'll either answer you directly or answer them at the end of January, or both, usually. And yeah, I will see you very, very soon. Bye-bye.